She was 52 years old, standing in a blizzard at the door of a stranger's cabin, with nothing left. No home, no family, no name that anyone would protect. Behind her, 100 miles of frozen mountain passes she had crossed alone. Ahead of her, a man who hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 years, holding a rifle and telling her to leave. She didn't move. Most people would have turned back long ago. Margaret Hale was not most people. This is the story of two people the world had already forgotten, and what happened when they refused to be forgotten. If this story moves you, hit like and drop the name of the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. A story of survival, courage, and the desperate edge of everything. The storm came without warning on the third day. That was the thing about the Colorado high country in the winter of 1883. It didn't warn you. It didn't negotiate. It simply arrived, white and absolute and indifferent, and it asked only one question of the living things beneath it. Are you strong enough to still be here when I'm done? Most weren't. Margaret Hale had been walking for 6 hours through knee-deep snow when the sky turned the color of iron and the wind shifted hard from the northwest. She felt it in her face first. That particular cold that didn't just sting but pressed, as though the air itself had a hand and was pushing her back down the mountain, back toward the valley, back toward everything she was running from. She didn't go back. She pulled the wool scarf tighter around her jaw, adjusted the small canvas pack on her shoulders. Everything she owned now fit inside it, and kept moving. One boot, then the other. The packed trails she'd been following had long since disappeared under fresh powder, and she was navigating now by memory alone, by the crude hand-drawn map her father had pressed into her palm 3 years before he died, and by something she couldn't name but felt in her chest like a compass needle that didn't point north so much as it pointed forward. The map said the cabin was near the second ridgeline past the burned pine grove. She had passed the burned grove an hour ago. It has to be close, she told herself. It has to be. She didn't let herself think about what happened if it wasn't. Margaret Hale had not always been a woman who walked alone through blizzards. There had been a time, not so long ago that she'd forgotten it, but distant enough to feel like someone else's life, when she had lived in a proper house in a proper town, with a husband and a name and a place in the order of things. She had been Mrs. Margaret Alderton then, wife of Robert Alderton, cattle broker, a good man, a quiet man, a man who worked himself into an early grave at 51 and left her with a modest deed to 40 acres on the edge of the Cimarron Valley and a handful of savings that were supposed to be enough. They hadn't been. Robert had trusted a lawyer named Fitch, a soft-handed, smooth-talking man from Denver who had drawn up the land deed and the will and smiled at the funeral and then, over the following 18 months, had slowly, methodically, legally dismantled everything Robert had left behind. A clause here, a filing there. A revised survey that somehow moved the boundary markers 40 feet to the east, cutting her water access in half. A note Robert had apparently signed, she'd never seen it, but Fitch had it, notarized and witnessed, that put a lien against the land for a debt she hadn't known existed. By the time Margaret understood what was happening, it was already over. The 40 acres were gone. The savings were gone. And Fitch, who had done everything through proper legal channels and could prove it in any court west of the Mississippi, had shaken her hand at the final proceedings and said, with the serenity of a man who had never lost a night's sleep, "I'm terribly sorry for your circumstances, Mrs. Alderton. I wish things had gone differently." She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had picked up her coat and walked out. There was no one waiting for her on the steps. No family, no friends, no one who owed her anything. Her parents were dead. Her one brother had moved to Oregon and had a wife who had never liked Margaret and children who didn't know her name. She had written to him twice after Robert died. He had not written back. She had spent that first winter as a boarder in a widow's house in a small town called Delwood, mending clothes and doing laundry for money and trying to understand how a woman could reach 52 years of age and find herself with nothing, no land, no income, no prospects, and no one in the world who was looking for her. The answer, she eventually concluded, was simple. She had trusted the wrong people. She had trusted Robert to live longer. She had trusted Fitch to be honest. She had trusted her brother to remember that she existed. She had trusted the world to behave the way it was supposed to behave. It hadn't. Fine. Then she would stop trusting the world and start trusting herself. The name Elias Granger had come to her from her father years before she'd ever thought she might need it. Her father, James Hale, had been a surveyor and a trapper in his younger years. A lean, hard-faced man from Virginia who had come west before the war and never gone back, who had mapped portions of the Colorado high country before most people knew those mountains had names. He had spoken of Elias Granger only a few times, and always in the same tone, quiet and certain, the way he spoke about things he had decided were simply true. "That man saved my life in the winter of '61, her father had told her once. "We were pinned down in a whiteout for 4 days above 12,000 feet. I would have died. He didn't let me. I've known many men in my life, Maggie. I've known perhaps 3 who I would trust with everything. Elias is one of them." She had listened and she had remembered, the way she remembered everything her father told her. She hadn't remembered it as a plan. It was just a name, filed away in the back of her mind like a letter you don't know you'll need until the day everything else is gone. The day everything else was gone had arrived the previous October. It had begun with Calvin Mercer. Calvin Mercer was 29 years old, the only son of Douglas Mercer, who owned the largest cattle operation in the Cimarron Valley, and who had died the previous spring, leaving everything to Calvin. Douglas had been a hard man, but a principled one. He had believed in fair dealing, had shaken hands on agreements and meant them, had built his empire through honest work and brutal weather and 50 years of stubbornness. Calvin was not his father. Calvin Mercer had grown up rich and handsome and absolutely certain that both conditions were permanent. He was the kind of man who mistook inheritance for achievement and size for power, who had never been told no in a way that stuck, and who had, as a result, developed no real understanding of what the word meant. He had decided, sometime in the summer following his father's death, that he wanted Margaret Hale's land, not because he needed it. The Mercer holdings were already vast, and 40 acres of the Cimarron Valley was a rounding error against that scale. He wanted it because it was adjacent to the northern range he was expanding, and because Margaret had politely declined his first offer, and because the act of declining had surprised him in a way that nothing had surprised him in years. No one declined Calvin Mercer. Not in the Cimarron Valley, not anymore. He'd made a second offer lower than the first. She had declined again. Then he had sent Fitch. She hadn't known at first that Fitch was working for Mercer. She had found out 6 months too late, when the lien appeared and the surveys were revised and the deed was filed and everything was over, and Fitch had shown her a document she had never seen before. A letter in her late husband's handwriting, assigning power of attorney to a holding company that Fitch controlled, dated 6 weeks before Robert died. She had stared at it for a long time. "That letter is a forgery," she said. "Mrs. Alderton," Fitch had said pleasantly, "that is a very serious accusation. I know what my husband's signature looks like. I lived with that man for 22 years. Handwriting can change under illness. I understand grief sometimes makes these documents difficult to accept. But the law? Don't tell me about the law." She had walked out then, and she had gone directly to the county sheriff, a man named Briggs, and she had told him everything. Briggs had listened politely, taken notes, and then done nothing. She had later learned that the Mercer family had been providing the sheriff's office with an unofficial annual contribution, call it a goodwill arrangement, for the better part of 15 years. After that, Calvin himself had come to see her. He had arrived at the boarding house in Delwood on a Tuesday morning, dressed in his good coat, hat in hand, the picture of respectful concern. He had sat across from her in the parlor and folded his hands on his knee and said, "Mrs. Alderton, or I suppose it's Mrs. Hale now, isn't it? I'm truly sorry about the way things have developed. That was never my intention." She had said nothing. "I want to make things right," he said. "I have a proposal I think you'll find generous. The proposal was this. She would come and work at the Mercer main house as a housekeeper and general domestic manager. She would have a room, 3 meals a day, a small wage. In exchange, she would drop any legal challenges against the land transfer and sign a document acknowledging the validity of the arrangement. In other words, come live in my house, work for me, and sign away any right to fight me." She had looked at him for a moment. He was watching her with the patient, mildly amused expression of a man who expected to be thanked. "No," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "No, I won't be doing that." The patience in his face thinned. "Mrs. Hale, I want you to think carefully. I've thought carefully. The answer is no. I'd like you to leave now." He had left, but not in the way a man leaves when he's been told no and accepts it. He had left in the way a man leaves when he's decided to use a different method. Within a week, the widow who ran the boarding house informed Margaret, apologetically and with genuine distress, that she would have to find other accommodations. Her credit at the dry goods store was suddenly refused. The one seamstress in town who had been sending her mending work stopped sending it. The message was clear and systematic. You have no money, and no land, and no allies here. You have no leverage. This is not a place that will protect you. She heard it. She understood it. She began to plan. She had one thing left, a carved wooden medallion that her father had worn around his neck for 30 years. A piece of pine about the size of a silver dollar, worn smooth by decades of handling, with a compass rose scratched into its face. He had given it to her the last time she saw him, pressing it into her palm with both hands, saying, "Keep this. And if you ever find yourself in real trouble, the kind I can't help you with because I'm already gone, go find Elias Granger. Tell him James Hale's daughter sent you. Show him this. He'll know." She had kept it. She had never expected to need it. In the first week of November 1883, she packed what she could carry, left Delwood before dawn, and started north toward the mountains. It took her 11 days to reach the high country. She had traveled partly by stage to a town called Henson Creek, then on foot once the road ended and the grades became too steep for any coach she could afford. She had spent 2 nights in abandoned line shacks, one night in a narrow cave out of the wind, and the rest in the open, wrapped in every layer she owned, watching the stars and trying not to think too carefully about the numbers. Temperature, distance, time. She was a woman of 52. She was not an experienced wilderness traveler. She had blisters on both feet and a cough that had started on day 4 and hadn't gone away. And there were moments, usually around 3 in the morning, when the cold settled in deepest, when she thought very clearly, this was a mistake. You're going to die out here and no one will know. She thought it clearly, and then she got up and kept moving. On the 11th day, she came over the second ridgeline past the burned pine grove, and through the thickening snow she saw a structure, low, dark, built hard against the rock face of the mountain like something that had grown there rather than been built. A cabin. Smoke coming from the chimney, thin and gray against the white sky. She stopped walking for a moment and simply looked at it. There it is, she thought. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders, wiped the snow from her face, and walked toward it. Elias Granger heard the footsteps before he heard the knock. He was at the workbench near the window, sorting the day's take from his trap line. 3 marten, 1 fisher, a red fox that had been half dead when he found it and was all the way dead now, when something made him look up. Not a sound exactly, more the way the air felt different when another living thing was approaching. He had lived alone long enough to be sensitive to that. He crossed to the window and looked out. There was a woman walking toward his cabin. He stood there for a moment, perfectly still, watching her. She was moving slowly but steadily through the snow, bundled in layers of dark wool, a canvas pack on her back. She was not young. She was not panicked. She was walking like a person who had decided to arrive here and had been working toward that decision for a very long time. He had not seen another person since August. He had not spoken a word aloud since September, when a passing trapper named Hobbs had come through with news from town and stayed for coffee and left before dark. Before that, it had been longer. He crossed to the door and took down the rifle from the rack above it. Not to use it, old habit. He unbarred the door and opened it. The woman stopped about 10 feet away and looked at him. She was perhaps 50, perhaps a little older, hard to tell with the cold in her face and the exhaustion under her eyes. Strong-boned and straight-backed, despite the weight of the pack. Her eyes were gray, clear, and unimpressed. She looked at him the way a person looks at a mountain they've committed to climbing. "You're Elias Granger," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who's asking?" he said. She reached into the front of her coat and pulled out something on a cord, a small piece of wood, carved, worn smooth. She held it out so he could see it from where he stood. The blood in his chest did something it hadn't done in years. He knew that medallion. He had watched an 18-year-old kid named James Hale carve it by firelight in the winter of 1859, the winter they had spent together above the tree line in a snow shelter the size of a horse stall, keeping each other alive by the simple method of refusing to give the other permission to stop trying. He hadn't seen James Hale in over 20 years. He had heard, through the irregular channels of frontier news, that James had died somewhere in New Mexico 3 years back. He looked at the medallion. He looked at the woman holding it. "You're James's girl," he said. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Hale. My father told me to find you if I was ever in real trouble." She paused, just briefly. "I'm in real trouble." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, down the slope, scanning the tree line out of habit. Nothing moving. Just snow and the wind picking up and the sky going the color of pewter in the west. He looked back at her. She was shivering. She was trying not to show it, but she was shivering hard. The deep kind, from the core. The kind that meant she had been cold for too long. "Get inside," he said. He stepped back from the door and held it open. She walked past him into the cabin without hesitation, and he closed the door behind them both. And outside the storm began in earnest. He gave her the chair nearest the fire. He didn't say anything while she pulled off the outer layers, the coat, the scarf, the second scarf underneath it, a pair of wool gloves that were soaked through. He hung them on the pegs by the door without being asked. He moved to the stove and put the kettle on and found the tin of dried spruce needle tea that he kept for medicinal purposes. It tasted like a pine tree had fallen into your cup, but it was hot, and it had things in it that kept you from getting sick. He poured 2 cups and brought one to her and sat down across the fire with the other. She was looking around the cabin in the way people do when they're assessing a place, quietly, without making it obvious, taking in the dimensions and the contents. He had known people who looked at places with judgment and people who looked at places with calculation. She looked at it with something more like recognition, like she was cataloging it carefully and storing what she found. He waited. After a moment, she said, "He talked about you, my father. He said you were the most reliable person he'd ever known in the mountains." "James was a good man," Elias said. "I was sorry to hear he was gone." "Were you? You hadn't seen him in 20 years. Some people you don't need to see," Elias said. "You just know they're out there, and it's all right. And then they're not, and it's not." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, finally, and he heard something move through the word like a current under still water. "That's exactly what it's like." He looked at her. "Tell me about your trouble." So she told him. All of it. The land, Robert's death, Fitch, Calvin Mercer, the forgery, the sheriff who took Mercer's money, the campaign of quiet pressure that had dismantled her life in Delwood piece by piece. She didn't embellish it and she didn't diminish it. She told it plainly, in the orderly way of someone who has spent time organizing facts because she expects to eventually have to present them to someone who matters. He listened without interrupting. He was good at listening. He had gotten very good at it during 20 years of mostly silence. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from me?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I don't know exactly," she said. "My father trusted you. I don't have anywhere else to go. I didn't come up here expecting you to fix everything. I came because I needed somewhere to be that Calvin Mercer's money and Calvin Mercer's sheriff couldn't reach me while I figured out my next step. If you'll let me stay through the worst of the winter, I'll work for my keep. I don't expect charity." "It's a hard winter up here. I walked 11 days through it," she said simply. "I'm aware of what it is." He studied her face. There was no performance in it. No calculation, no softness deployed for effect, just the same plainness she'd used to tell her story, a kind of exhausted precision, like someone who has burned away everything unnecessary and is left with only the true thing. He thought about James Hale, who had kept him alive in the winter of 1861 by telling terrible jokes, and then, when the jokes ran out, by being quietly, stubbornly, persistently present, by simply refusing to stop existing beside him when existing was very hard. "There's a back room," Elias said. "Small. Cold in the nights till you get the stove going. It's yours for the winter." Something moved across her face. Not relief exactly, more like the careful private lowering of a weight she'd been carrying for a very long time. She didn't say thank you in the easy way. She said it in the measured, direct way of a person who means it. "Thank you, Mr. Granger." "Elias," he said. "Thank you, Elias." Outside, the storm hit the mountain in full force. The walls of the cabin shuddered once, and the fire bent in a gust that found its way through some gap in the chinking, and then steadied again. The kettle sang low on the stove. Margaret Hale reached into her pack and set her father's compass medallion on the table between them, face up, the scratched rose pointing northeast toward the cold heart of the mountains. She folded her hands around the warm cup and looked into the fire, and for the first time in a very long time, she was still. That was the first night. They did not know yet what was coming. They did not know about the men Calvin Mercer had already hired, or the instructions he had already given, or the name of the tracker, a man called Silas Vane, who was even then studying the ground in Delwood, looking for the direction a solitary woman had taken north through the first snow of November. They did not know any of that. They knew only what was in the cabin: a fire, 2 cups of terrible tea, the smell of pine smoke and cured hide, and the clean cold of mountain air coming through the walls, and outside the sound of a blizzard that had decided to be patient and stay a while. It was, in its way, a kind of peace. It would not last, but it was real, and it was theirs, and for that one night at the beginning of the worst winter in 20 years, it was enough. The first week was the hardest, not because of the cold, though the cold was severe, temperatures that dropped past 30 below in the deepest part of the night, cold that crept under the door and pooled along the floor and found the gaps in your clothing with a kind of patient intelligence. Not because of the work, though there was relentless work from before first light until after dark. It was hard because of the silence between them, the specific, loaded silence of 2 people who are strangers to each other and are now trapped in a space the size of a large parlor with nowhere to go and nothing to do but learn what the other person actually is. Elias had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten the weight of being watched. Not stared at. Margaret was too careful for that, but observed. He felt her attention the way you feel weather coming, a subtle shift in the quality of the air, a peripheral awareness that something nearby was paying close attention to the same world you moved through. It made him careful in ways he hadn't been careful in years. He noticed himself thinking before he spoke. He noticed the cabin differently, through her eyes, he supposed, and found it wanting in ways he had stopped seeing. The walls were dark with smoke. The floor was rough-hewn planking with gaps wide enough to lose a coin in. The single window had an oiled skin covering instead of glass, and it let in a dim, amber-colored light that was adequate but nothing more. He had lived in this dimness for years and stopped perceiving it. Now he perceived it. He did not say any of this. He simply, quietly, began to do things he had been putting off for years. He filled the floor gaps with fresh caulk. He rehung the door so it sat flush in the frame and stopped letting in that thin, cold knife of air along the bottom edge. He didn't explain himself. She didn't ask him to. For her part, Margaret moved through the first days with a kind of quiet deliberateness that he recognized from his years in the mountains. The deliberateness of someone who understands that in a hard environment, wasted motion is a form of waste you cannot afford. She asked him, on the second morning, to show her where everything was: the food stores, the tool chest, the medical supplies, the water barrels, the extra wood stacked outside under the lean-to. He showed her. She asked clear, specific questions. She did not ask the same question twice. By the 4th day, she had reorganized the dry goods shelf in a way that made more logical sense than the arrangement he had used for years, and he had looked at it for a moment and decided not to say anything, because it was, in fact, better. On the 5th morning, she appeared at the door of the main room before he was up, already dressed, holding 2 cups of spruce needle tea. "I heard you wake up," she said, setting 1 cup on the table beside him. It seemed useful. He sat up and took the cup. "You sleep light." "I always have," she said, and sat down across from him with her own cup, tucking her feet up under her on the chair the way he had noticed she always did when she was settling in for something. "My husband used to say that I slept like a sentry. He meant it as a complaint, but I always thought it was a reasonable way to be." "Usually is," he said. They drank their tea in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind was moving hard through the spruce trees, a sound like a distant river. "I want to learn the trap line," she said. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "That so. I'm not here to sit inside and be useful in a domestic sense while you do all the actual surviving," she said. "I told you I'd work for my keep. I meant real work. Show me what you do." He looked at her for a moment longer, then set down his cup. "All right," he said. Get your boots on. The trapline ran for 11 miles through the high timber, a loop that took most of a day to walk in summer and the better part of 2 days in deep snow. He didn't take her the whole length at first. He took her to the nearest section, the lower run along the creek drainage, 7 traps over about 3 miles. And he showed her how each trap was set and why, how to read the snow around it for sign, how to reset a sprung trap that had caught nothing, how to dispatch cleanly when it had caught something. She watched everything with the same careful, cataloging attention she had turned on the cabin. She did not flinch at the parts that required flinching. When he showed her how to reset a number 4 Newhouse trap, a job that required both hands and real strength to compress the springs, she tried it once, failed, adjusted her grip and her body position, and tried again. The second time, the trap clicked into set. "Good," he said. "It's harder than it looks," she said, looking at it. "Most things are." She looked up at him. There was the faintest suggestion of something in her expression, not quite a smile, more a brief acknowledgement that the observation was accurate and applied broadly. "Yes," she said, "most things are." They walked back to the cabin in the late afternoon light, the snow around them going gold and then orange and then a deep cold blue as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. He noticed, without particularly meaning to, that she matched his pace easily. Not the pace of a woman trying to keep up, but the natural rhythm of someone who had found the right speed for the terrain and the temperature and the length of distance remaining. It was a mountain person's walk. She'd developed it somewhere in the past 11 days, or perhaps she'd had it in her before and he hadn't seen it yet. "Your father," he said, as they came in sight of the cabin, "used to say that the mountain either makes you or it breaks you. No middle ground." "He said the same thing to me," she said. "He said you were the one who told him that first." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Did he?" "He did. He also said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever met, and that he meant it as the highest compliment." Something moved through his chest, old and quiet and not entirely comfortable. "James was a harder man than anyone gave him credit for," he said. "I know," Margaret said. "I'm his daughter." The weeks settled into a rhythm. They rose before light. Elias worked the far end of the trap line. Margaret, once she had learned it well enough, worked the near end alone. They met back at the cabin by midday and spent the afternoon on the maintenance work that kept a mountain cabin alive through winter, splitting and stacking wood, checking and rechecking the food stores, mending equipment, treating and stretching the pelts from the trap line. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, often not, and the silence between them slowly changed character. It lost the weight and became, over time, something more like companionship. He learned her in pieces the way you learn a landscape, slowly, by moving through it over time, until one day you realize you know where everything is without having to look. He learned that she had a precise and unsentimental mind, that she used to do things like reorganize the cabin storage and calculate whether their food supply would last until the pass cleared in spring, but that she could also sit for 20 minutes watching a red-tailed hawk work the updrafts above the cabin with an expression of such concentrated pleasure that it was almost uncomfortable to observe, like watching someone pray. He learned that she never complained about her physical condition, not once, not even on the day she came back from the near trap line with a gash on her left forearm from a sprung trap jaw and sat down at the table and cleaned and dressed it herself without saying a word. And when he asked what happened, she said, "Trap snapped back on me. I was careless. It won't happen again." And it didn't. He learned that she had been genuinely deeply happy with Robert Alderton, and that his death had left her not just bereaved, but— and this was the part she said most quietly, one evening when the fire was low and they had both been talking more than usual— lost. Not in the practical sense, in the interior sense. "I knew who I was when I was with him," she said, "not because he defined me. He wasn't that kind of man, but because he saw me clearly, and when someone sees you clearly and still chooses you, it does something to your self-understanding. And then it was gone, and I had to figure out who I was without anyone looking." She paused and looked into the fire. "I think I'm starting to figure it out," she said. Elias said nothing. After a moment he added a log to the fire, and the flames rose and the room warmed, and outside the wind continued its long conversation with the spruce trees, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more. He did not tell her anything comparable about himself, not yet, but he thought about what she had said for a long time after she had gone to her room for the night, about being seen clearly by someone. and what it does to a person when that disappears. He had been married once. Her name had been Clara. Their daughter had been named Rose, and she had lived for 3 years and 2 months before the fever came through in the spring of 1863 and took her in 4 days. Clara had survived another 2 years after that, but she had not really survived. She had gone through the motions of living, growing quieter and more distant with every season, until one morning she had simply not gotten up, and by the following evening she was gone, and the doctor in town had put the cause of death as cardiac failure, which was accurate in the literal sense and incomplete in every other. After that, Elias had come up the mountain and stayed. He had not talked about this in 20 years. He was not going to talk about it now. But he noted, that night, something that surprised him. The fact that Margaret was in the next room, separated from him by a wall of rough pine planking, and that he could occasionally hear the faint sounds of her moving, settling, making the small sounds of a living person in a quiet space. He noted that this was not unpleasant. He had forgotten how not unpleasant that was. He fell asleep faster than he had in years. It was on a Saturday in the 3rd week of December that the first real sign came. Elias had been up the eastern ridge, checking a line of traps he ran higher up when he found the tracks. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. 2 sets of them, large, heavy-soled, moving along the ridgeline from the south. They were 2 days old, maybe 3, partly filled in by the light snow that had fallen since. But they were there, deliberate and directional, and whoever had made them had stopped at the high point of the ridge where the cabin below was visible, and had stood there for a while. The snow was compressed and disturbed in a rough circle, before turning back south. He stood at the high point himself and looked down at the cabin. From here it was a small dark shape against the white slope, smoke barely visible against the pale sky. But visible. Fundable, if you knew what you were looking for and were patient enough to look. He did not run back to the cabin. Running attracted attention and burned energy you couldn't afford in the cold. He walked back at his usual pace, but his mind was working through the possibilities with the calm, systematic speed of a man who has spent decades making fast decisions in wilderness conditions. When he came through the door, Margaret looked up from the pelt she was working and read something in his face immediately. "What is it?" she said. He sat down and told her about the tracks. Her hands stilled on the pelt. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very evenly, "How long do you think we have?" No way to know. Could be they were just passing through. Could be they were marking the location to report back. They were marking the location, she said. She said it with certainty, not fear. Calvin would have hired someone specific for this. He's not the kind of man who sends people into the mountains on speculation. If those men were here, they were sent for a reason, and they found what they were sent to find. You know him well enough to know that. I know men like him well enough, the ones who've never been told no. When you take something from them, even just your own freedom, they don't consider it done. They consider it a debt, and they are patient about collecting debts. He looked at her. She was sitting straight, jaw set, the fear visible in her eyes but not in the rest of her, controlled, directed inward, converted into something more useful. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Are you?" He thought about it honestly. "Cautious," he said. She nodded. "That's better than frightened. Tell me what we need to do." They began preparing that same evening. Elias took stock of the weapons: a Winchester repeating rifle, a Sharps single-shot long rifle, 2 revolvers, ammunition enough for a sustained defense, but not for a prolonged one. He showed Margaret the Winchester and spent an hour in the dying light of the afternoon making sure she could load, aim, and fire it accurately. She had never shot a rifle before. She hit the target, a knot on a pine tree 40 yards out, on the 5th try, and on the 6th and on the 7th. "Don't shoot unless you have a clear shot and there's no other choice," he told her. "And if you shoot, shoot to end it." "I understand," she said. "People say they understand. Then the moment comes and it's different than they thought." She looked at him. "I understand," she said again, and something in the way she said it, quiet and absolute, without defensiveness, told him that she did. He also began working on something he had kept to himself since she arrived, a secondary exit from the cabin. He had planned it years ago, in the abstract way that a man who lives alone in the mountains plans for every contingency, and had done perhaps a third of the work before the urgency faded and other things took precedence. Now he worked on it with purpose. A low tunnel through the back wall, concealed on the exterior by a hinged section of the wood store lean-to, which could be swung aside to allow a person to crawl through into the hollow at the base of the rock face, and from there move unseen along the rock to the east, into the heavy timber. He worked on it at night, after Margaret was asleep, not wanting to alarm her with the implication of needing it. He discovered, however, on the third night of this work, that she was not asleep. "I can hear you," she said quietly through the wall. "I've been hearing you for 3 nights. What are you building?" He sat back on his heels and considered lying to her, and then discarded the idea. "An exit," he said, "in case they come in force." There was a pause. "Show me," she said. She came through and crouched beside him in the low space, and he showed her the plan and the progress, and she said, "The angle of the tunnel needs to go deeper before it turns, or someone on the outside will be able to see where it exits if there's good light." She was right. He adjusted the angle. She picked up the second-hand tool and began working beside him without being asked, and they worked together in near silence until nearly midnight, when the cold became genuinely dangerous and they both went to bed. After that, she worked on it with him every night. It took them 8 more days to complete it. When the last section was done and they tested it, both of them crawling through in sequence, out into the cold and the dark and back again, she looked at the concealed entrance from the outside for a long moment, assessing. "You can't see it at all," she said, "not even if you're looking." "That's the idea," he said. She looked at him in the dark, her breath making small clouds in the frozen air. There was something in her expression he couldn't entirely read, something that had to do with the tunnel and the preparation and all the evenings of shared work, but was also something larger than any of those things. "You're very good at staying alive," she said. "So are you," he said. She looked at him a moment longer, then she turned back toward the cabin, and he followed, and neither of them mentioned it again. Christmas came and went without ceremony. They did not speak of it being Christmas, but on the morning of December 25th, Margaret appeared at breakfast with a small package wrapped in a piece of tanned hide, tied with a piece of sinew. Inside was a pair of gloves she had made from the softest marten pelt from the trapline, cut and sewn in the evenings while he thought she was simply working on pelts for trade, stitched with a precision that impressed him more than he showed. He looked at them for a moment, then looked at her. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He put them on. They fit perfectly. He didn't ask her how she knew the size. She had been watching everything since the day she arrived. He had nothing to give her in return, which bothered him more than he expected. He thought about it for the rest of the morning, and then in the afternoon he went to the shelf above his bunk, the shelf where he kept the 3 things he considered non-negotiable, and took down the worn leather-bound almanac that had been his primary navigation reference for 20 years, and brought it to her. "It's got 20 years of my handwritten weather notes in the margins," he said, "and survey data for the whole high country between here and the divide. It'll tell you where to go and what to expect when you get there." She took it with both hands and looked at it carefully, turning the pages and reading a few lines of his marginalia in silence. "This is the most valuable thing you own," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She looked up at him. This time the expression on her face was entirely readable, and he looked away from it without meaning to. Turned to the window, where outside the snow was falling again, steady and thick, blanketing the world in a clean white quiet that made everything seem briefly very far away. She did not say anything else. She set the almanac carefully on the table beside her father's compass medallion, and the 2 objects sat there together in the firelight. The compass that had brought her here, and the book that showed where here was. And the afternoon darkened slowly toward evening, and neither of them moved to light the lamp for longer than was strictly practical, because the firelight was enough and the quiet was good, and outside the snow was coming down with no intention of stopping any time soon. They had no way of knowing that 60 miles to the south, in the Cimarron Valley, a man named Silas Vane had just returned from the mountains and was sitting across a table from Calvin Mercer, accepting payment and providing a location, and that Calvin was already planning, with the cold efficiency of a man who had never accepted a no that stuck, exactly how many men he would need and how soon he could move. The storm would delay them. It delayed everything. But a storm, no matter how patient, always ends. The storm that had given them Christmas gave them January, too, and most of February, and for a while it seemed as though the mountain itself had decided to protect them, piling snow against the passes, sealing the high trails under drifts that no rider could push through without losing horses and men both. Elias watched the weather with the attention he gave everything, patient, analytical, without sentiment. He knew the mountain was not protecting them. The mountain was indifferent, as it had always been. The snow that closed the passes was the same snow that made the trapline murderous to work, and the wood supply an ongoing calculation, and the water situation a daily problem, as the creek froze harder and they had to break through successive layers of ice each morning to get to running water below. But it bought them time, and they used the time. They used it to complete the hidden exit and learn it until they could navigate it in complete darkness. They used it to move a cache of food and ammunition and supplies to a location Elias knew, a shallow cave 2 miles east through the timber, accessible from the exit tunnel's opening, invisible from above and nearly so from below. They used it to go over scenarios the way soldiers go over battle plans, calmly, methodically, stripping out the emotion and focusing on the decisions that would need to be made and the sequence in which they would need to be made. Margaret was good at this. Better, in some ways, than he was. He thought in terms of terrain and weather and the physical logistics of movement. She thought in terms of people, what Calvin would decide and when, what his men would do and why, where the pressure points in a confrontation were, and how to use them. "He won't come quietly," she said one evening in late January, the almanac open on her knee, her finger tracing the topography of the eastern approach. "That's not who he is. He'll come with enough men to feel certain, and he'll come expecting to simply take what he believes is already his." "How many men do you think?" She considered. "Enough to feel safe. Not so many that it looks like what it is. 5, maybe 6. Silas Vane to lead them in. He knows the terrain now. The rest will be hired guns, the kind Calvin can pay well enough to ensure discretion." 6 armed men, Elias said. "Against the 2 of us," she said evenly. "Those aren't good numbers." "No." "No," she agreed. "Which means we don't fight them on their terms. If they come to the cabin, they expect us to be in the cabin. If we're not there, or not where they expect, the numbers change." He looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about almost nothing else for 2 months," she said without apology. They built a plan. It was not a perfect plan. No plan survived contact with reality fully intact, and Elias knew this well enough not to love any plan too much. But it was a good plan, built on the specific terrain and the specific weaknesses of men who are confident they have the advantage and therefore stop looking carefully. What they could not plan for was the day itself, when the sky would clear, when the passes would open, when Silas Vane would decide the conditions were finally right to bring 6 armed men up the mountain. That decision was made in the 2nd week of March. Elias knew something was wrong before he saw anything. He was on the western section of the trapline, moving through old-growth spruce in the early morning when the forest went quiet in that particular way. Not the natural quiet of cold and stillness, but the reactive quiet of animals that have detected something that doesn't belong and have collectively decided to stop moving until they understand what it is. The birds went first, then the squirrels, then nothing, just the creak of frozen wood and the sound of his own breathing. He stood still for 10 seconds, scanning, listening. Then from the south, faint but unmistakable to a man who had spent 20 years learning to read sound in these mountains, the sound of horses moving through snow, more than one. Moving carefully, trying to be quiet, which meant they knew they were close to somewhere they didn't want to be detected approaching. He turned and ran, not toward the cabin. He ran east first, cutting through the timber on a line that would bring him above the cabin rather than directly to it, so he could see the approach before he exposed himself. He moved fast and low, staying in the trees, using the terrain the way he'd used it for decades, reading the ground ahead, anticipating the angles, always keeping something between himself and the open. He came out on the rock shelf above the cabin at a low crouch and looked down the southern slope. There were 7 of them, 7 riders, moving in a loose column up the approach trail, the same trail Margaret had walked up alone in November, the trail that was the only reasonable route to the cabin from below. They were still perhaps a quarter mile down the slope, moving slowly through the heavy snow. Silas Vane was at the front. Elias didn't know the man, but read him immediately from the way he moved, alert and deliberate, reading the terrain ahead with a professional's attention. Behind Vane came Calvin Mercer, easily identifiable at this distance by the quality of his coat and the way he sat his horse, The easy, unconscious posture of a man who had been on horseback since childhood and had never lacked for a good animal. Behind Calvin, 5 more men, all of them armed, 2 of them carrying rifles across their saddles in the manner of men who expected to use them. Elias pulled back below the rock line and moved. He came through the cabin door at a controlled run, and Margaret was already on her feet, her hand going instinctively toward the Winchester on the wall. "How many?" she said. 7, quarter-mile south, maybe less. Calvin's with them." Her jaw set. Her hand completed the motion and took down the Winchester. "How long?" 10 minutes, 15 if they're careful on the upper grade. He was already moving, pulling on his coat, checking the revolver at his hip. "Stay with the plan." "I know the plan," she said. "Margaret." She looked at him. There was fear in her eyes, real, honest fear, not the controlled kind she usually showed, and underneath it something harder and cleaner, like iron under a thin coat of frost. "I know," she said quietly. "I know, Elias." He held her gaze for one moment, then he nodded and went to take his position. They came into the clearing in front of the cabin with the particular confidence of men who have rehearsed this in their minds and are not expecting resistance. Calvin Mercer rode at the center, flanked by 2 of his men, Silas Vane just ahead. The remaining 4 fanned out loosely as they entered the clearing, not with military precision, but with the casual alertness of men who considered themselves prepared for whatever a 64-year-old mountain trapper and a middle-aged widow could offer. The cabin door was open. That was the first thing that gave Calvin pause. He had expected to knock, or to break down a door, or to find the occupants peering from the window. An open door was not in the rehearsal. "Hello, the cabin!" he called. Nothing. Silas Vane was already scanning the perimeter, his eyes moving in careful arcs. He said nothing, but his right hand moved fractionally toward the rifle across his saddle. "Margaret Hale!" Calvin called, his voice taking on the tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable and authoritative simultaneously, a tone that had worked, in his experience, reliably. "I know you're here. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to have a conversation." "Then have it." Her voice came from above and to the right, from the roof of the lean-to wood store, where she had climbed before they arrived and positioned herself with the Winchester and a view of the entire clearing. The angle was good. Elias had chosen the spot. 7 heads turned. Calvin looked up at her, a woman sitting calmly on the edge of the roof in the cold morning air with a rifle across her knees, and something moved through his expression that he was not quite able to suppress. Surprise. And beneath the surprise, the first thin crack of something else. "Come down from there," he said. "This is beneath both of us." "I'm quite comfortable," Margaret said, "and I can see everyone from here, which I find useful. Say what you came to say, Calvin. You know why I'm here." "I know what you think you're here for," she said. "You think you're here to collect me, like a piece of property, like that land you stole, something that can be picked up and moved and reassigned as you see fit." Her voice was level, not angry, not frightened, factual. "I'm not property. I've never been property, and I'm not going anywhere with you." Calvin's jaw tightened. He glanced at his men, aware that he was being addressed this way in front of them, aware of what that meant for how they would read him. The legal situation regarding the Alderton land was settled in a court of law. "With a forged document," she said, "a letter in my late husband's handwriting that my late husband never wrote. I have 2 witnesses prepared to testify that they saw Fitch's clerk copying Robert's signature from an old letter 3 days before the filing date. I have the original letter, the real one, the one your man was copying from, with a date that makes the timeline impossible." The clearing was very quiet. Several of Calvin's men were exchanging glances. Silas Vane had not moved, but his eyes were now on the tree line rather than on Margaret, and that shift in attention meant something. "You have no such evidence," Calvin said, but his voice had changed, less smooth now, more effortful. "You'd be surprised what a woman has time to collect when she's been systematically dismantled by the same man for 2 years," she said. "Every letter Fitch sent, every altered survey, a sworn statement from your own surveyor's assistant, who apparently has more conscience than the rest of your operation." She paused. "I've been waiting for the right audience for all of it. A courtroom would do nicely, a federal court specifically, since I believe the forgery of a legal document crosses several jurisdictional lines that Sheriff Briggs isn't positioned to make disappear." The crack in Calvin's composure widened. He turned to the man on his right and said something low that Elias, positioned in the timber 30 yards to the east, could not hear. The man nodded and began to move his horse to the left. A flanking motion, edging toward the angle that would put the wood store below Margaret's position and cut off her sightline to the main group. "Hold where you are," Elias said. He stepped out of the timber with the Sharp's rifle at his shoulder. He had positioned himself at the exact angle he had calculated 3 weeks ago, the angle that gave him a line on the flanking riders without putting the cabin behind them. The barrel was steady. At this range, with this rifle, it was not a difficult shot. The flanking rider stopped. Silas Vane turned slowly and looked at Elias with the careful, assessing look of a professional who is rapidly revising his understanding of a situation. His eyes went from Elias to Margaret, on the roof to Elias again, mapping the geometry. Elias watched him do the math and arrive at the same answer Elias had arrived at weeks ago. The two of them had chosen their positions to cover the entire clearing without a blind angle. Every man in that clearing was in someone's line of fire. There was no flanking option that didn't expose the flanker to a clear shot. Vane's hand moved away from his rifle, slowly and visibly, and rested on his saddle horn. "Mr. Mercer," Vane said quietly, "I'd like to revisit the parameters of this arrangement." Calvin wheeled on him. "I'm paid to track and locate," Vane said evenly. "I didn't agree to this." He nodded toward the two positions, the two weapons. "This is a different thing." The silence in the clearing was the specific silence of a situation that has reached a decision point and is waiting for someone to decide which direction it goes. Calvin decided wrong. "Take her down," he said to no one and everyone. "Now, both of them if you have to." Nobody moved. One of the hired men, a thick-shouldered man in a brown coat at the back of the group, said, in the flat, practical voice of a man conducting a business negotiation, "You didn't say anything about a rifle on the roof and a Sharps in the trees, Mercer. That changes the rate." "I'll double what I'm paying you. There's no number," the man said, with the same flat practicality. "A man can spend money. He can't do that dead." 3 of the 5 hired men had already begun backing their horses toward the south trail. The movement was slow and deliberate, the careful retreat of men who understand that the situation has resolved itself and want to leave the resolution behind without collecting any of it. Calvin Mercer sat his horse in the center of the clearing and watched his assembled force evaporate, and his face did something that Elias, watching from the tree line, had seen in men before and recognized. It collapsed inward, briefly, then hardened into something uglier than confidence. The look of a man who has been publicly humiliated and is converting the humiliation, in real time, into a pure and directionless fury. "This isn't finished," Calvin said. He was looking at Margaret on the roof, and his voice was low enough now that it carried only a few yards, but in the quiet clearing it was perfectly audible to everyone who remained. "You think this paper you're waving around protects you. It doesn't. Not from me. Not out here." "You should leave now, Calvin," Margaret said. "I'll burn this place to the ground." "Calvin?" Her voice had changed. Not louder. Harder. "Look at where you are. Your hired men are halfway down the mountain. Your tracker has his hands on his saddle horn and has been looking at the south trail for the past 3 minutes. You are alone, in the snow, at 10,000 feet, and you are threatening the wrong people." She held his gaze from the rooftop with the same steady, iron-calm attention she had turned on everything since November. "Ride down the mountain, go back to your valley, and think very carefully before you do anything else, because the next move you make will be made in front of people who aren't on your payroll." He looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then he pulled his horse around and rode south, and Silas Vane followed without a word, and within 2 minutes the clearing was empty and silent, except for the sound of wind through the spruce trees, and the distant diminishing sound of hoofbeats going down the slope. Margaret sat on the roof with the Winchester across her knees and watched them go. Elias came out of the timber and crossed the clearing and stood below the lean-to roof looking up at her. Her face, now that the riders were gone and there was no one left to be steady for, showed the full weight of the last 20 minutes. The fear and the effort of holding the fear in check, and the sheer concentrated work of doing what she had just done. "You all right?" he said. She let out a breath that was not quite steady. "Ask me again in an hour," she said. He almost smiled. He put out his hand to help her down from the roof, and she took it. and he steadied her as she dropped to the ground and stood beside him in the snow, and neither of them let go of the other's hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "The paper," he said. "The evidence you described. Do you actually have it?" She looked at him, and the expression on her face was the closest thing to wry that he had ever seen from her. "Some of it," she said. "The letters from Fitch, the survey discrepancies, not the witness statement. I was hoping he didn't know that. He might come back to test whether you were bluffing." "Yes," she said, "he will." She turned and looked at the south slope, already empty and white and quiet, the hoof prints of 7 horses already softening at the edges as the cold morning air began to fill them in. "Which is why we can't be here when he does." He looked at her. She looked back at him. And in the space between them, in the cold air of a March morning above 10,000 feet, with the mountains all around them and the world they needed to navigate still entirely unsettled, something shifted, quiet and irrevocable, like the moment a frozen river decides it's done being ice. He said nothing. She said nothing, but the decision was there between them as clearly as if they had spoken it aloud. They went inside and began to pack. They worked quickly and without wasted motion, the way they had learned to work together over 3 months of daily necessity, each of them knowing without discussion what needed to be done and who would do which part of it. Elias took down the weapons, checked and loaded them, packed the ammunition. Margaret rolled the food stores into packs that could be carried or lashed to the single horse Elias kept in the small enclosure behind the cabin. She packed the almanac. She packed her father's compass medallion, though the cord had broken weeks ago, and she now kept it loose in her coat pocket, where she touched it sometimes without thinking. She packed the evidence, the letters, the survey documents, everything she had kept folded inside the back cover of the almanac since November, the paper record of everything that had been done to her, preserved through 600 miles of Colorado winter in the pages of a worn leather book that a man had given her on Christmas morning. Elias came and stood in the doorway of the back room while she was finishing, watching her tuck the last folded document into the pack. He had his coat on and the sharps slung across his back, and the look of a man who has made a decision and finished making it. "There's a cave," he said, 2 miles east. "We cached supplies there in January. We can hold there for a few days while I figure out the best way down." "Not the South Trail," she said. "No. The South Trail is Calvin's. There's a northern route, longer, harder. Takes 3 days instead of 1, but it comes out near a town called Garnet Ridge, and I know people there." She looked at him. "People who would help?" "People who owe me," he said, which in his understanding of frontier economics was a more reliable thing than people who were simply willing. She picked up the pack and settled it on her shoulders. The same motion, the same adjustment, the same straightening of the back that she'd had when she arrived at his door in November, except that the person doing it was not the same person who had arrived. She was harder now and more certain, and the pack sat differently on her, like something belonging to her rather than something she was enduring. She looked around this cabin once, at the reorganized shelves and the repaired floor and the window that now had a proper skin covering sewn tight enough to keep out most of the cold, at the fireplace where they had sat through 100 evenings, at the table where the Christmas gloves had been given and the almanac received, and where, on an uncountable number of nights, they had talked their way from strangers into something that didn't have a simple name but was more than either of them had expected to have again. She did not let herself linger on it. She turned and walked through the door. Outside, the March sky was a hard, clean blue above the peaks, and the snow was brilliant in the late morning light, and the forest to the east was dark and quiet, and full of the particular depth that mountain wilderness has in winter, that sense of something vast and patient and entirely indifferent to human affairs, waiting beyond the first line of trees. Elias came out behind her and pulled the door shut. He did not lock it. There was nothing in it now worth protecting, and besides, a locked door was an advertisement that the occupants intended to return. They didn't know yet if they intended to return. That was a question for the other side of whatever came next. He took the lead rope of the horse. She fell in beside him, and they walked east into the timber, into the dark and the cold and the long way around, and behind them the cabin sat empty in the snow, the fire gone cold, the smoke no longer rising, looking for all the world like a place that had been abandoned, which was, for now, exactly what they needed the world to believe. The northern route was everything Elias had said it would be: longer, harder, and entirely unforgiving in the way that the high country was unforgiving in March, when the snow was deep enough to be dangerous, but soft enough in the afternoon sun to become treacherous, crusting over at night into something that would hold a man's weight for 3 steps and then collapse under him without warning on the 4th. They moved carefully, and they moved quietly, and they did not talk much on the first day because the terrain demanded attention and because there was, between them, a kind of concentrated focus that talking would have diluted. Elias led with the horse on the rope and read the ground ahead with the automatic, unconscious skill of a man who had been doing it for decades. Margaret followed in his tracks, placing her feet where he placed his, conserving energy the way she had learned to conserve it over 3 months of daily work at altitude. By moving efficiently, breathing steadily, not fighting the mountain but negotiating with it. By the time they stopped for the night, in a shallow depression in the rock face that cut the wind to something manageable and gave them a ceiling of stone to hold the heat of the small fire Elias built from dead spruce, they had covered perhaps 8 miles on a route that felt like 20. Margaret sat against the rock with her pack behind her back as a cushion and her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water that Elias had heated over the fire, and she looked at the sky above the fire, a narrow strip of absolute black salted with stars, and said nothing for a long time. Elias fed the horse and then sat across the fire from her and also said nothing. The fire between them was small and disciplined, enough to warm but not enough to be seen from any distance, the kind of fire a man builds when he is in the mountains and doesn't want to advertise his location. After a while she said, "What are they doing right now, do you think?" He knew who she meant. "Calvin's back in the valley by now. A ride from our elevation to the valley floor, even on a bad horse, is 4 hours. He's been back since afternoon." "And angry?" "Very." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "He'll go back to the cabin. Probably tonight. If not tonight, tomorrow morning. And when he finds it empty, he'll understand that we didn't just run. He'll understand that we left with a purpose." "Which will make him more dangerous," Elias said. "Not less." She looked at him across the fire. "How long before we reach Garnet Ridge?" 2 more days if the weather holds and the upper grade hasn't drifted over. Could be 3 if it hasn't. "And your people there? The ones who owe you? Ranchers mostly, a merchant or 2. A man named Cord Hennessy who runs the freighting operation and who I pulled out of a collapsed mine shaft about 12 years ago." He paused. "And a woman named Ada Pruitt who runs the dry goods and knows every person and every piece of business within 40 miles of Garnet Ridge. If there's a federal court circuit coming through, and there usually is in April, Ada will know the judge's name and his schedule and what kind of man he is." Margaret took that in. "You trust them?" "I trust Hennessy completely. Ada I trust to do what's in her interest, and her interest is a town that functions without interference from valley money. So yes, in this case, I trust her." She nodded slowly, and he could see her processing it, not with anxiety, but with the methodical, forward-moving attention she brought to every problem. "The evidence I have is real, but incomplete," she said. "The forged letter is the keystone, and I can't prove the forgery without an expert who can examine the document alongside authenticated samples of Robert's handwriting. Fitch will have the original. I can't get to it." "What can you prove without it?" She was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving not quite to the fire, but to some middle distance that was really the interior of her own thinking. "The survey discrepancies. The boundary alteration. Those are documented, and the documentation exists in the county records. It can be pulled and examined, and the alteration is obvious to anyone who compares the pre- and post-survey maps. That establishes that fraud was committed." She paused. "The letter from the surveyor's assistant, I don't have it, but I know his name. Thomas Birch. He worked for Mercer's surveyor for 6 years and quit in November, about 3 weeks after I left Delwood. The timing is suggestive. He might talk. He might. If he's approached by someone with legal authority rather than by a woman he has every reason to avoid because she's being hunted by his former employer." She looked at the fire. "It's a chain of ifs." "Most things worth doing are," Elias said. She looked at him for a moment, then something shifted in her expression, briefly, quickly, and she looked back at the fire. "You sound like my father." "James said that?" "Every time I told him something was too uncertain to try." A pause. "He was usually right." "Usually," Elias agreed. The fire settled, and above them the stars moved in their slow, indifferent arc, and around them the mountain breathed in the cold way it breathed at night. A deep, subsonic stillness that wasn't silence so much as the absence of anything hurried. Elias added the last piece of wood to the fire, and it caught and burned small and steady. He looked across it at Margaret, who had closed her eyes, her back straight against the pack, her breathing evening out toward sleep. He watched her for a moment. He had no word for what he was feeling, or rather he had words, but they all belonged to a vocabulary he had stopped using 20 years ago, and he was not certain they still applied to him or to anything in his life. He only knew that there was something in his chest when he looked at her, something quiet and persistent, and entirely unlike the numb endurance that had constituted most of the past 2 decades, and that it had been growing steadily since approximately Christmas morning and showed no signs of stopping. He looked away. He pulled his coat tighter and watched the fire and kept watch until the deepest hours of the night, and then he allowed himself to sleep. They reached the upper grade on the second day at noon and found it drifted but passable, and came through it in 2 hard hours with the horse lunging and scrambling through sections where the snow was chest deep, and Elias went first on foot breaking trail, and Margaret held the rope and talked to the horse in a low, steady voice that seemed, improbably, to help. On the other side, they stopped to rest the horse and stood together at the edge of a clearing that looked out over the lower country to the north. A vast tilted expanse of snow-covered forest and frozen creeks, and far below, the first suggestion of valley floor, brown and gray and beginning, just barely, to show the dark lines of roads and the pale geometries of buildings. Garnet Ridge, Elias said, pointing to a cluster of structures at the base of a long ridge that gave the town its name. 6 miles. Margaret looked at it for a long moment. It looks small, she said. It is small. About 300 people. Is that enough? He looked at her. Enough for what? Enough people that Calvin can't simply buy his way through them the way he did in Delwood. Elias was quiet for a moment, looking at the town below. Garnet Ridge isn't Delwood. The people down there have been dealing with valley money trying to move in on their range and their freight routes for 10 years. They're not afraid of it. They're tired of it. He paused. There's a difference between people who are afraid and people who are tired. Afraid people can be controlled. Tired people get things done. She was looking at him with that careful, steady attention that he had come to know meant she was not just hearing what he said, but measuring it, testing it for the specific weight of truth. You believe that, she said. I know these people. I know, she said. That's why I believe it too. They began the last 6 miles. Cord Hennessy was exactly what Elias had described. A broad, red-faced man in his mid-50s with hands the size of supper plates, and the deliberate, considered manner of someone who had spent his life making decisions about weight and balance and how much a thing could carry before it broke. He answered his door at the freighting office on Garnet Ridge's main street on the afternoon of the second day, took one look at Elias, and said, You look like you've been in the mountains all winter. I have, Elias said. You better come inside. Inside, over coffee that was stronger than anything they'd had in months, Elias told him the story. Cord listened the way he listened to everything, without interruption, without visible reaction, letting the information settle its full weight before he responded. Margaret sat across the table and watched him and said nothing, reading him the way she had learned to read people, attending to what they did with their hands and their eyes rather than what they did with their words. He asked 3 questions when Elias finished. All 3 were practical and precise. When he had the answers, he set his coffee cup down on the table and looked at Margaret directly for the first time. You have the survey documents with you? In my pack, she said. The circuit court comes through Garnet Ridge in April. Judge Harlan Proctor. He's been on this circuit for 9 years, he's honest. And he has no love for Cimarron Valley interests because they tried to have him reassigned 4 years ago, and he knows it. Cord paused. You'd need a lawyer to file a formal complaint. I know one in Delwood who might be persuaded to take a case on contingency if the evidence is solid enough. The evidence isn't complete, Margaret said. There's a witness I haven't been able to reach. Thomas Birch. He was a surveyor's assistant for the Mercer operation. If he'd testify... Birch, Cord said, and the word had a different weight in his mouth than it had in hers. Thomas Birch quit the Mercer operation in November and came to Garnet Ridge in December. He's been working my freight yard since January. The silence at the table lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "He's here," Margaret said. "He's stacking crates in the back warehouse right now," Cord said, with the mild satisfaction of a man who has just resolved a significant logistical problem. He stood up. "I'll go get him." When Cord left the room, Margaret turned and looked at Elias. He was watching her with an expression she had rarely seen from him, something warm and unguarded, the look of a man who is genuinely pleased. "You look surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm relieved. There's a difference." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "This doesn't end it. Even with Birch, we still need to face Calvin publicly in a way that removes any doubt about what he's done. A court filing is the beginning, not the end." "I know. He'll know where we are the moment word gets out that we came down from the mountains. He has people everywhere." "I know." She looked at him. "You're not worried?" "I'm planning," he said, which was his version of the same thing. Thomas Birch was 26 years old and looked younger, a slight pale man with the permanently chapped hands of someone who worked outdoors and the watchful, slightly hunched posture of someone who had spent months expecting trouble. He sat across the table from Margaret and turned his hat in his hands and would not quite meet her eyes. And Elias sat to one side and said nothing, because this was Margaret's conversation, and he knew it. "I know what you want," Birch said, after she had explained who she was. "You want me to say what I saw." "I want you to tell the truth," she said. "That's all." "Telling the truth about Calvin Mercer isn't a small thing," he said. "I left the valley because I was afraid. I came up here because I thought distance was enough. If you testify, Margaret said, you do it with the weight of a federal court behind you, and a community that has every reason to make sure you're protected afterward." She paused. "I'm not asking you to stand alone, Mr. Birch. I'm asking you to stand with me. And I want to be honest with you. I'm not a powerful woman. I don't have money or connections. What I have is the truth and the documentation to support it, and a judge who isn't bought." She leaned forward slightly. "But I need the testimony. Without what you saw, I can prove fraud in the abstract. With what you saw, I can prove who ordered it." Birch looked at his hat. Then he looked up at her, and what moved across his face was not quite courage. It was something more uncomfortable than courage, more like the moment when a person realizes that the thing they've been running from has caught up to them, and the only question left is whether they turn to face it or keep running until they can't. "I saw Fitch's clerk," he said quietly. "A man named Dodd. I saw him with 2 letters on the table in front of him. One was old, I could see the yellowing from where I stood, and one was new paper. He was copying. The signature. I understood what I was seeing." He paused. "I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my business. I've been telling myself that since November, and I'm tired of the sound of it." "Will you testify to that?" Margaret said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes." Margaret sat back. She let out a breath that she had been, without knowing it, holding since November. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me when it's over." "Fair enough," she said. The next 10 days moved with the specific urgency of a thing that has been set in motion and cannot be stopped, only guided. Elias rode out the first morning and spent 3 days visiting ranchers and trappers and freighters he had known for years, men who lived in the country between Garnet Ridge and the Divide and who had their own long-standing grievances against the slow expansion of Cimarron Valley money into their ranges and their routes. He did not ask them to do anything dramatic. He asked them to be present, to come to Garnet Ridge on a specific date and stand where they could be seen and counted. "What for?" asked a rancher named Delbert Crane, leaning on his fence post and squinting into the March wind. "For the same reason you stand a horse in a pasture to keep wolves from the fence line," Elias said. "Presence is its own argument." Crane looked at him for a long moment. "Calvin Mercer isn't going to like this." "No," Elias agreed. "He isn't." "When?" "April 10th, Garnet Ridge. Bring anyone who wants to come." He rode to 6 more properties before he turned back toward town. At each one, the conversation was different in detail and similar in shape. A careful man weighing risk against principle and arriving one by one at the same conclusion, that the risk of staying quiet had finally outpaced the risk of speaking. Meanwhile, Ada Pruitt, who was exactly what Elias had described, a small, sharp-eyed woman of 60 who had run the dry goods on Garnet Ridge's main street for 30 years, and who knew everything about everyone within 40 miles, had made contact with the lawyer in Delwood. His name was Orrin Vass, and he was the kind of lawyer who had come west with ideals and kept most of them, which made him unusual in any territory and exceptional in this one. He read the documents Margaret sent him via Ada's courier and wrote back in 3 days. The survey fraud is documentable and damaging. The witness testimony, if it holds, is the cornerstone. With both, a case can be made not just against the land transfer, but against the individuals who executed it. I will be in Garnet Ridge by April 8th. Please ensure your clients and their documentation are available. Margaret read the letter twice and handed it to Elias without comment. He read it, set it on the table, and looked at her. "It's moving," he said. "It's moving," she agreed, "which means Calvin will feel it moving. He'll hear about Vass, he'll hear about the letters. Probably. There are no secrets in this country for long. He'll come." "Yes." She picked up the letter again, looked at it, set it down. "He'll come because he can't afford not to. If he lets this proceed without a countermove, it's over for him. He knows that." "What kind of countermove?" She looked at him steadily. "The kind where he stops trying to be legal about it." The warning came from an unexpected direction. Silas Vane arrived in Garnet Ridge on a Wednesday morning, alone, on a tired horse, without the bearing of a man on a mission. He found Elias at Cord Hennessy's freighting office and sat across from him and said, without preamble, "I don't work for Mercer anymore. I want you to know that first." "All right," Elias said. "He's got 4 men coming up from the south. Not hired guns this time. The kind of men you don't hire for legal work. The kind you hire when you want something burned or someone frightened past the point of talking." Vane paused. "They'll be in Garnet Ridge by April 7th, day before your lawyer arrives." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Vane looked at his hands on the table. "Because I tracked that woman through 100 miles of mountain passes and watched her walk up to your cabin. And any woman who walks 100 miles through a Colorado winter to fight for what's hers deserves better than what Mercer is planning." A pause. "And because I've done enough work in my life that I'm not proud of. I'd like to do something different before I get too old to remember why it matters." Elias looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Can you use a rifle?" "Better than most," Vane said. "Then you'd better stay." April 7th arrived cold and clear. The sky the hard, specific blue of high altitude in early spring. The streets of Garnet Ridge still frozen in the morning and soft with melt by afternoon. The 4 men Calvin had sent arrived as Vane had said, quietly, without announcement, taking rooms at the single boarding house and eating at the saloon and watching the street with the particular studied casualness of men who are waiting for something. What they had not anticipated was being watched in return. Cord Hennessy had positioned 2 men at the far end of the street. Delbert Crane and 4 of his ranch hands had ridden in the previous evening and were staying at Crane's cousin's property at the edge of town. Silas Vane knew all 4 of Calvin's men by sight and spent the day tracking their movements from a second-floor window of Ada's dry goods. And Elias Granger spent the day being visible. He walked the main street of Garnet Ridge at his normal pace, stopping to talk to people he knew, standing in front of the freighting office in the afternoon sun, conducting himself with the quiet, unhurried deliberateness of a man who is exactly where he intends to be and has no concern about being anywhere else. He was 64 years old, and he looked it, and he also looked like what he was. A man who had lived 20 years alone in the high country and survived every winter and had no illusions left about what the world could do to a person, and who had decided for the first time in 2 decades that there was something worth standing in front of. Calvin's men watched him. He watched them watching him. Nothing happened, because nothing needed to happen. The math was visible, and everyone could do it. The 4 men who had come to intimidate walked a town that was not intimidated, and understood by the end of that day that the job they had been sent to do was not accomplishable in these conditions. 2 of them left on the morning of April 8th. The other 2 stayed, but staying was all they did. Orrin Vass arrived on April 8th as promised, a lean, gray-haired man of 55 with ink-stained fingers and a worn leather case that he carried like it contained everything that mattered, which in a legal sense it did. He sat with Margaret for 2 hours, went through every document, questioned her in the careful, probing way of a man who is preparing to have the same conversation in front of a judge and needs to know exactly where the weaknesses are. Then he spoke with Thomas Birch for an hour. Then he sat alone for 20 minutes with nothing but a cup of coffee and the documents spread on the table in front of him. Then he looked up and said to Margaret and Elias both, "This is enough. With testimony, this is enough." Margaret held the stillness of that moment for as long as she could. The specific stillness of someone hearing a thing they have been working toward for a very long time, trying to feel all of it before it became ordinary. Enough to get the land back? Enough to have the transfer declared fraudulent. What follows from that, the question of the land itself, that's a separate proceeding. But the fraud, and the individuals who committed it, Voss paused. Yes, that can be proved. She nodded. Once. Then let's prove it, she said. April 10th was 2 days away. Judge Harlan Proctor would arrive on the evening stage from the south. The people Elias had spoken to were already converging on Garnet Ridge. Ranchers, trappers, freighters, merchants, a steadily growing assembly of people who had their own reasons to want this particular confrontation to go a particular way. And Calvin Mercer, 60 miles south in the Cimarron Valley, was getting reports every few hours about the way things were developing in Garnet Ridge, and his remaining 2 men in town were sending him the same message in different words. This is not what you thought it was. This is bigger than you thought, and further along than you thought, and the people standing beside that woman are not people who will move. He was a man who had never been told no in a way that stuck. He was about to find out what that felt like. He made the decision on the night of April 9th, the wrong decision, as his decisions had increasingly been wrong since the morning in November when a woman had declined his offer in a boarding house parlor and he had mistaken refusal for weakness. He saddled his best horse and rode north with 2 men flanking him, arriving in Garnet Ridge at first light on April 10th, because Calvin Mercer had spent his entire life believing that if he simply arrived somewhere in person, the situation would resolve itself in his favor. He rode up the main street of Garnet Ridge as the sun came over the eastern ridge, and the street was already lined with people. Not threatening, not armed, not arranged in any way that looked like opposition, just present. Ranchers and trappers and merchants and their families standing along the boardwalk in the cold April morning, watching him ride. He recognized some of the faces from the valley. He saw Delbert Crane. He saw men he had done business with for years, men whose ranges bordered his, men who had always, in his experience, been manageable. They were not looking at him with hostility. They were looking at him with something quieter and more permanent than hostility. They were looking at him the way people look at something they have decided about. He stopped his horse in the middle of the street, and Elias Granger stepped off the boardwalk and stood in the street and looked at him. And behind Elias, Margaret Hale stepped out of the door of Ada Pruitt's Dry Goods and stood on the boardwalk with Orrin Vass beside her and Thomas Birch to her left, and the documentation of everything Calvin had done in the leather case under the lawyer's arm. Calvin looked at her. She looked back at him. She was wearing the same coat she'd had on the day she walked into Delwood to tell the sheriff about the forgery. The best coat she owned, dark wool, brushed clean, buttoned straight. Her hair was up. Her back was straight, and her expression, across the distance of the main street of Garnet Ridge on a cold April morning, was the same expression she'd had at the door of the cabin in November. Not angry, not triumphant, not afraid. Simply certain. "Calvin," Elias said from the middle of the street, his voice carried clearly in the cold air. "Judge Proctor is at the courthouse. He's expecting you." Calvin Mercer sat his horse in the street and looked at the town arranged around him and understood, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be in a place where his money and his name and his father's legacy meant nothing, where the only currency was what you had actually done and who was willing to stand up and say so. He looked at the 2 men who had ridden with him. They were looking at the street, at the numbers, at each other. He looked at Margaret one more time, then he dismounted. The courthouse in Garnet Ridge was a single-story building of rough-cut stone that doubled as the town hall, and on occasion, the only room large enough to hold a meeting that the entire town needed to attend. Judge Harlan Proctor had been using it as his circuit courtroom for 9 years, and he had developed, over those 9 years, an efficient and unsentimental relationship with frontier justice, which is to say that he believed in the law with the particular conviction of a man who had seen what happened to places where the law was merely theoretical, and he had no patience for people who treated it as a system to be gamed rather than a structure to be upheld. He was a tall man, gray-haired, with a long face and deep-set eyes that had the quality of appearing to evaluate everything they looked at. He had arrived the previous evening, as promised, reviewed the materials Orrin Vass had sent ahead with Ada's courier, and spent the morning reading them again with careful attention. When Calvin Mercer walked through the courthouse door at 8:30 on the morning of April 10th, Judge Proctor was already seated, already prepared, and already decided about the nature of the proceedings, which were not, strictly speaking, a trial, but a formal evidentiary hearing that could become the foundation of one. The room was full. Every seat was occupied, and men were standing along both walls and in the back, the combined body heat of perhaps 80 people making the small stone building warmer than it had any right to be in early April. Margaret sat at the table to the left with Orrin Vass on one side and Thomas Birch on the other. Elias sat in the first row behind her, not at the table because he was not a party to the legal proceedings, but close enough that she could feel his presence the way you feel a fixed point when everything else is moving. Calvin sat at the opposite table with a lawyer he had brought from the valley, a man named Garrett, young, expensively dressed, with the polished manner of someone who had learned law in a proper Eastern school and had not yet spent enough time in a frontier courtroom to understand that the rules were different here in ways the curriculum hadn't covered. Garrett looked at the crowd along the walls and at the judge and at the materials spread on the opposing table, and some of his polish began to visibly thin. Calvin himself sat with the stiff, controlled posture of a man maintaining composure by an act of will. He had not looked at Margaret since he walked in. Judge Proctor called the hearing to order with a single knock of his gavel, and the room went so quiet that the creak of the building in the morning wind was clearly audible. "This is an evidentiary hearing on the matter of a disputed land transfer in Cimarron County," Proctor said, in the measured, carrying voice of a man who had been making himself heard in rooms like this for 30 years. "We are here to determine whether the documentary evidence submitted constitutes probable cause for a formal fraud complaint to be filed in federal court. The standard is probable cause, not proof beyond reasonable doubt. We are not convicting anyone today. We are deciding whether there is sufficient basis to proceed." He looked at both tables. "Mr. Vass, you may begin." Orrin Vass stood. He was unhurried, and his lack of hurry was itself a kind of argument. The deliberate ease of a man who knows that what he has is enough and does not need to perform urgency. He began with the survey records. He walked through the boundary alteration with the methodical precision of a man who had practiced this presentation in his head many times and had stripped it of everything that wasn't essential. The original survey, conducted in 1879. The revised survey, filed 18 months after Robert Alderton's death. The specific discrepancy: 40 feet to the east, removing Margaret's water access from the Cimarron Creek tributary. The name of the surveyor who filed the revision: a man named Cole, employed by the Mercer operation for 11 years. "The original survey is in the county record," Vass said. "The revision is also in the county record. The discrepancy is visible to anyone who compares them. I submit both as exhibits." He set them before the judge. Proctor examined them without expression for 2 minutes. "Proceed," he said. Then Vass called Thomas Birch. Birch stood and walked to the witness position with the careful, deliberate movement of a young man who has made a decision and is in the process of discovering whether he can sustain it under pressure. He was pale, and his hands were not entirely steady, but his voice was clear when he spoke, and it stayed clear through everything that followed, through the direct examination that established who he was and what he had seen, through Garrett's cross-examination, which was aggressive and attempted 3 times to suggest that Birch's memory was unreliable or his motives impure, and through the sustained, attentive silence of 80 people listening to every word. He said what he had told Margaret in Cord Hennessy's office. He said it plainly, without embellishment. He described the 2 letters on the table, the old paper and the new, and the man copying one signature from one to the other, and the date, and the location, and who else was present. "And you're certain of what you saw?" Garrett said, on cross. "This was a brief observation. You were passing through a room. You did not stop to examine the documents. You did not speak to anyone about it. You cannot produce any physical evidence to support—" "I know what I saw," Birch said. His voice was quiet but absolutely firm. "I've worked with surveys and documents my entire professional life. I know what a signature being copied looks like. I know what old paper looks like against new paper. I know what I saw, and I have been wishing for 5 months that I had said something about it immediately. And I am saying something now." The room was very quiet. Garrett looked at his notes. He had no follow-up question that would improve his position, and he was smart enough to know it. "No further questions," he said, and sat down. Then Vass called Margaret Hale. She stood and walked to the witness position, and the room, already quiet, became something even more attentive, as rooms do when the person at the center of a story finally speaks in their own words. She had dressed carefully that morning, not to perform anything, but because the occasion required a certain precision of presentation, and she understood that and respected it. She answered Voss's questions with the same factual steadiness she had brought to everything since November. The timeline of events, the correspondence with Fitch, the circumstances of the lien, the progressive campaign of social and economic pressure in Delwood, the meeting with Calvin in the boarding house parlor, and the offer he had made and her refusal and what followed. She spoke in the past tense, which gave everything she described the weight of something completed rather than something ongoing, a record, not a complaint. Garrett's cross-examination focused on discrediting her credibility as a witness. She was a party with obvious interest in the outcome. Her husband's financial affairs had been complex, and she admitted she had not fully understood them. Her accusations against named individuals were serious, and the supporting evidence is in front of the judge, Margaret said calmly. "I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it. The survey discrepancy exists in the county record. Mr. Birch's testimony speaks to the document forgery. What I can speak to is what was done to me, specifically, systematically, over a period of 2 years. And I have done so." She paused. "Is there a question in what you're saying, Mr. Garrett? Because if there is, I am happy to answer it." Garrett looked at her. She held his gaze without difficulty. "No further questions," he said. She walked back to her seat and sat down. She did not look at Elias, but she felt him, that fixed, steady presence 1 row behind her. And it was enough. Judge Proctor took 40 minutes. He sat in his chamber, which was actually Ada Pruitt's back storage room, temporarily cleared for the purpose, and reviewed everything. And at the end of 40 minutes, he came back through the door, and everyone stood, and he sat down, and everyone sat down, and he opened his notes and read from them without preamble. He found that the survey discrepancy constituted sufficient evidence of fraudulent alteration to warrant federal investigation. He found that Thomas Birch's testimony, taken in conjunction with the documentary evidence, constituted probable cause for a fraud complaint against the individuals named. He issued a formal order directing the county record office to freeze any further transactions on the Alderton land parcel pending the outcome of a federal proceeding. He referred the matter to the federal district court with a recommendation that it be heard at the earliest available session. Then he looked up from his notes and said, in a tone that was different from his judicial voice, still measured but with something underneath it that was not neutrality, "I want to observe, for the record and for the benefit of everyone in this room, that the conduct described in these proceedings represents the kind of abuse of legal process that depends on the isolation and vulnerability of its victims. It depends on those victims having no one to speak for them and no forum in which to be heard. The fact that Mrs. Hale is standing before this court today, after what she has endured and after the journey she has undertaken to be here, is a demonstration that isolation is not always permanent and vulnerability is not always terminal." He looked at the room. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. For 1 second, the room held its breath. Then sound came back into it, the kind of sound a room full of people makes when tension releases. A collective exhale that was not quite cheering but was something more than silence. People were on their feet. Cord Hennessy said something to the man beside him and put his hand on his shoulder. Ada Pruitt, who had been sitting in the second row, stood and straightened her coat with the composed satisfaction of a woman whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. Orrin Vass turned to Margaret and said, "That's the beginning. The federal case will take time, months, possibly a year. But Proctor's referral carries significant weight, and the freeze on transactions means the land can't move again until it's settled." "I understand," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Vass." "Thank Thomas Birch," he said. "And thank whoever convinced you to make the trip to Garnet Ridge." She turned and looked at Elias. He was standing, his hat in his hands, watching her. The room was moving around them, people talking, voices rising, the ordinary human noise of a community processing a significant moment. In the middle of it, they were briefly still. She crossed to him. She stood in front of him and looked up at him with the direct, unguarded expression that she had rarely allowed herself, and that he had learned over the course of a long, hard winter to recognize as the purest form of her attention. "It's a beginning," she said. "Yes," he said. "There's more to do." "There always is." She held his gaze. "I'm not leaving. I'm not—" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April morning had fully arrived, and through the small stone windows of the courthouse the sky was intensely blue, and the peaks to the west still white with winter, and the town that had stood with them was alive with voices and movement and the particular energy of people who have done something they will remember. "I know," he said. And then, because it was true and he had stopped having reasons to leave it unsaid, "I don't want you to." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she put out her hand, not the tentative way of people who are uncertain, but the direct way of people who have already decided. And he took it and held it, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said. Calvin Mercer left Garnet Ridge before noon. He had not spoken during the hearing except through Garrett, who had done his professional best and been outworked at every turn. He had sat through Proctor's remarks with the rigid stillness of a man who is deciding between responses and has not yet identified one that is available to him. When the gavel came down, he had stood, straightened his coat, and walked out without speaking to anyone. In the street, one of his men brought his horse. He mounted, and Garrett mounted beside him, and the two men who had ridden with him from the valley fell in behind. He did not look back at the courthouse. He did not look at the people on the boardwalk who watched him go. He rode south on the main street of Garnet Ridge at a walk, because there was nothing to be gained by hurrying, and because the only thing left to him was the small and insufficient dignity of not appearing to flee. He was arrested 3 weeks later. The federal marshal came for him on a Tuesday morning in early May at the main house of the Mercer operation, with the papers signed by the federal district court and Proctor's referral attached. Fitch was taken the same day, in Denver, by a different marshal. Dodd, the clerk Thomas Birch had seen copying signatures, was found in a boarding house in Santa Fe and arrested the following week. The trial lasted 11 days. Orrin Vass presented the case with the same patient precision he had brought to Garnet Ridge, augmented by 3 additional witnesses who had come forward once the federal process was underway. People who had direct knowledge of specific fraudulent acts, but who had been, until Garnet Ridge, too isolated or too afraid to speak. Thomas Birch testified again, and this time his voice was steady from the first word. Fitch received 5 years in federal prison. Dodd received 3. Calvin Mercer, as the architect of the scheme and the party who had directed and financed every step of it, received 7 years, with a formal order voiding all land transfers made under fraudulent instruments and returning the properties to their rightful owners. Margaret was in Garnet Ridge when the verdict came through, delivered by wire to Ada Pruitt's dry goods. Because Ada had a standing arrangement with the telegraph operator in the county seat, having long since concluded that information was the most important inventory she carried. Ada walked the telegram herself to the house where Margaret and Elias had taken a room during the legal proceedings, and she knocked on the door, and when Margaret opened it, Ada held out the paper and said simply, "It's done." Margaret read it once. Then she read it again. Then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands for a moment. And Ada, who had built 30 years of her life on the pragmatic management of frontier circumstances, said nothing and allowed the moment to be what it was. "Thank you, Ada," Margaret said. "Don't thank me," Ada said. "You did the work." She turned and walked back down the boardwalk, and the morning of Garnet Ridge carried on around her, indifferent and ordinary and alive. They went back to the cabin in June. The mountain in June was a different country than the mountain in November. The passes clear, the lower slopes loud with snowmelt, wildflowers already pushing through in the south-facing meadows, the air carrying the smell of wet earth and new growth and the particular freshness that exists only above 8,000 feet when winter has finally released its grip. The horse moved easily on the trail that had been knee-deep in snow the last time they traveled it. Margaret had been up this trail twice now. The first time in November, alone, walking toward an unknown man and an uncertain future, carrying everything she owned in a canvas pack and her father's compass medallion in her coat pocket. Now she rode beside Elias, and the pack on the horse's back held things they had bought in Garnet Ridge: glass for the cabin window, proper tools, seed for a kitchen garden, A small collection of books that Ada had pressed on her with the practicality of someone donating to an essential cause. The compass medallion was still in her coat pocket. It always would be. They came over the ridge in the late afternoon, and the cabin was below them. Small and dark against the summer slope, the rock face behind it streaked with snowmelt, a pair of hawks riding the updraft above the eastern timber. The door was still closed. The wood store lean-to had lost part of its roof to winter weight and would need repair. The kitchen garden plot Elias had started years ago and largely abandoned was overgrown and needed to be turned. Margaret looked at it for a long moment. Elias stopped his horse beside her and waited. "It needs work," she said. "Everything worth keeping does," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the cabin with the expression she had come to know as his most honest one. The one he wore when he wasn't performing anything, not stoicism, not caution, not the careful minimalism he used as a default presentation to the world. Just a man looking at a place he had built and spent 20 years in and nearly left. Looking at it now with someone beside him who intended to stay. "I want to put in a proper window," she said. "Glass, south-facing, so the light comes in the afternoon. I bought glass in Garnet Ridge." "I know, I was there." A pause. "I want a porch." He looked at her. "A porch?" "A small one, just wide enough for 2 chairs, so we can sit in the evening and watch the light change on the western ridge." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the calculation move across his face. Not reluctance. She had learned to read him well enough to know the difference between reluctance and the habitual caution of a man who had spent 20 years with no one to build anything for. "That's a reasonable amount of lumber," he said. "I know how to use a saw," she said. "I know you do." "Then it's a project." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then the corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved when something genuinely pleased him. The smallest possible version of a smile, the one he'd rationed so severely for so many years that it had stayed sincere. "It's a project," he agreed. They rode down the slope to the cabin together. They were married in August. The ceremony was held in the meadow below the eastern timber, on a Saturday morning when the sky was so clear it seemed to have no ceiling, and the wildflowers in the meadow were at the peak of their late summer intensity. Indian paintbrush and columbine, and the small yellow clusters whose name Margaret had learned from Elias in May, and whose name Elias had learned from a woman he had known 30 years ago, and had never expected to have occasion to teach to anyone else. Cord Hennessy came up from Garnet Ridge, and Ada Pruitt and Thomas Birch, who had decided to stay in Garnet Ridge permanently, and had been given a permanent position in Cord's freighting operation. Delbert Crane came with his wife, a quiet, steady woman named Frances, who had brought food enough for 20 people and organized the proceedings with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to making things work. Silas Vane came and stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he wasn't certain he had the right to be, and has been told, quietly and firmly, that he does. Orrin Vass sent a letter, because he was in Denver for a separate proceeding and could not make the journey in time. The letter was 1 paragraph long, and its last line read, "The law can establish justice, but it takes people to make it mean something. I have rarely seen it mean as much as it did in Garnet Ridge this spring." Margaret read the letter aloud to Elias the evening before the ceremony, sitting on the new porch. Small, just wide enough for 2 chairs, facing west so the evening light came across the ridge in long gold bars that moved slowly down the slope as the sun dropped. The chairs were plain wood, made by Elias's hands, sanded smooth and fitted with cushions that Margaret had sewn from flour sacking and filled with dried spruce needles, which gave them a faint, clean scent that she had come to associate entirely with this place. "He's right," Elias said when she finished. "About the law? About people making it mean something." He was quiet for a moment, watching the light on the ridge. "I spent 20 years up here believing that staying away from people was the same as staying safe. That the less you were connected to anything, the less anything could hurt you." She looked at him. "Were you wrong?" "Yes," he said simply. "I was wrong. Staying away doesn't protect you from pain. It just makes sure you experience the pain alone, which is worse, and that you don't experience anything else either, which is the real cost." He paused. "I'm 64 years old, and I'm just now understanding this, which is either very late or exactly on time, depending on how you look at it. She reached over and put her hand over his, where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the light continued its slow movement down the western slope, and the evening settled around them with the deep particular quiet of high altitude in summer, and neither of them felt the need to add anything to what had already been said. The ceremony the next morning was short and direct, the way both of them preferred things. Cord Hennessy, who held a justice of the peace commission from the county that he had rarely had occasion to use, stood in the meadow with the mountains behind him and read from a brief set of words that Margaret and Elias had agreed on together, and that said, in clear, uncomplicated language, what they intended to do and to be for each other. When it was done, and Cord had said the formal words, and they had turned to face each other in the meadow with the assembled company behind them, Elias took both of her hands in his and looked at her. This woman who had walked 100 miles alone in winter to knock on his door, who had learned his trapline and built his exit tunnel, and sat beside him through a long siege and stood on his rooftop and held a rifle steady while she told a powerful man the truth. And he found that he had, after 20 years of silence, quite a few things he wanted to say. He did not say most of them. He was not that kind of man, and he had not become that kind of man, and she did not expect him to be. She knew him. That was the whole thing. After 64 years and a long winter and a great deal of loss and one unexpected beginning, someone knew him completely and had decided to stay. He said the words that the occasion required. They were true, and he meant them, and that was enough. She said hers, looking at him with the direct and unguarded expression that he had learned was the purest version of her, not performing composure or strength or certainty, just present, just completely and honestly there. And he listened to every word. Cord said, "I now pronounce you," and the rest of it, and the assembled company made the kind of noise that assembled companies make when something right has happened. Margaret Granger, she had thought about the name for weeks before the ceremony and had decided that she wanted it, not because she was surrendering anything of herself, but because a name shared with someone is also a declaration. And she was not afraid of declarations, turned to the people gathered in the meadow and felt, for the first time in years, that the circle of the world around her contained more warmth than threat. The homestead expanded slowly, the way good things expand, through work and intention and the occasional piece of luck, without haste. They built the porch, and then, the following spring, a proper addition to the back of the cabin that doubled its size and gave them a separate room for work. A desk for Margaret's ongoing correspondence with Orrin Vass about the land case, and the shelf where she kept the growing record of the high country survey work she had begun doing with Elias, mapping the territory the way her father had once mapped it, updating the information in the almanac that lived permanently on the desk between the compass medallion and the letter from Vass. The land itself, the 40 acres in the Cimarron Valley that had started everything, was formally returned to her by court order in the spring of the following year. She did not go back to live on it. She had thought carefully about this and arrived at the decision without sentiment. The valley land was part of a past, and the past was finished, and she was not the woman who had lived in it. She sold it at fair price to Delbert Crane, who had been running cattle on the adjacent range for 20 years and who paid her honestly and shook her hand the way his father had taught him to shake hands. She put the money into the homestead and into a modest fund that she and Ada Pruitt established together, informally, without legal structure, through the simple mechanism of Ada telling people about it, for the purpose of helping women in the high country who found themselves without resources or recourse. It was not a large fund. It helped, over the years, a number of people in modest and practical ways. A stage fare paid, a legal consultation arranged, a room provided while a situation was resolved. She never thought of it as charity. She thought of it as what you do with luck that you didn't fully earn. You make sure it moves. Silas Vane came back to the mountains. He had spent the winter in Garnet Ridge doing various work for Cord Hennessy, and in the spring he rode up to the cabin and stood at the door and said to Elias, somewhat awkwardly, that he was thinking of taking up a trap line of his own in the northern range, if that wouldn't conflict with existing claims, and Elias said it wouldn't and showed him the maps, and after that Vane became the closest thing they had to a neighbor, present sometimes, absent for long stretches, reliable when needed, and gradually, over years, the kind of person whose presence at the cabin for an evening meal felt natural and unremarkable. He was, Margaret thought, a good example of something she had come to believe, that people were not fixed things. They were works in progress, capable of revision, given the right conditions and the right amount of time. Vane had been a man who tracked people for money without asking questions about why. He had become, through a sequence of small decisions, turning his hand away from his rifle in a clearing, coming to Garnet Ridge with a warning, standing in the meadow at a wedding he hadn't been certain he deserved to attend. Someone different. Not transformed, not saved, just quietly and stubbornly amended, which was the only kind of change that lasted. Thomas Birch married a woman from Garnet Ridge in the fall and named his first son James, which he told Margaret was not a coincidence. She cried a little, privately, in the way she did when something touched the place where her father lived in her memory, that warm and permanent room that she visited sometimes and always left feeling, not sadder exactly, but more aware of the full weight of what had been given to her in her life and what she intended to do with the remainder of it. The winter of 1885 came early and hard, as Colorado winters did, and found the homestead prepared for it the way the homestead was always prepared now, wood stacked high, food stores counted and supplemented, the new glass window triple-latched against the coming wind. On the first real night of it, when the snow came hard from the northwest and the temperature dropped fast and the mountains went invisible behind the white, Margaret and Elias sat on the enclosed porch, enclosed now, with the addition of a low wall and a proper roof, a concession to practicality that had not diminished the view, and watched the storm arrive. The fire behind them was built up high. The lamp on the table between their chairs threw a warm circle of light. The almanac was on the table, open to the weather notes for November, where Elias had been adding new observations that afternoon. He was 66 now. His hair was fully white and he moved slightly more carefully on cold mornings. And there were days when the old joints in his hands were difficult. But he was still the most capable person in the high country above 10,000 feet, and he showed no signs of becoming otherwise. She was 54. The winter had put lines in her face, and her hair had gone mostly silver, and she was stronger in her body than she had been in her 40s, because she had spent 2 years doing the kind of work that her 40s had not required. They sat and watched the snow come. After a while, she said, "I've been thinking about the Northern Survey, the section above the elk meadow. We mapped it to the second creek crossing last September, but the upper drainage is still blank. We can get up there in July," he said, "if the snowpack isn't too heavy on the north-facing slopes. It won't be. This winter is going to be dry above 12,000. Look at the cloud structure. It's all moisture below that elevation." He looked at the clouds, which were invisible in the dark and the snow. "You're reading weather from clouds you can't see." "I'm reading the snow structure and the wind direction and extrapolating," she said, "which is what you've been teaching me to do for 2 years. I said it was dry last October and I was wrong by 8 inches. You were wrong because you didn't account for the late-season moisture from the south, which I have now noted in the marginalia." She paused. "So technically your error is now permanently recorded in the almanac as a caution to future observers." He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "That's uncharitable." "It's accurate," she said, and the word landed with the particular warm precision that it had between them. "Not a joke exactly, but not nothing either. The shorthand of two people who have been paying attention to each other for long enough that a single word can carry a great deal." The storm built outside. The snow came sideways past the porch roof and the wind moved through the spruce trees in the long sound like a distant river. And the world above the tree line went white and absolute and entirely indifferent, as it had always been and would always be. Inside the small circle of lamplight, on a porch that hadn't existed 18 months ago, above a valley they had left behind and a past they had put down, two people the world had written off, too old, too damaged, too alone, too far from anything that counted, sat together in the warm and quiet, watching the mountain do what mountains do. And it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the full, surprising, completely unearned gift of a second life, arrived at the end of everything else, not despite the loss and the struggle and the long, cold winter, but through it, because of it, built from the same material as the difficulty and standing because of it. The way the cabin stood because it had been built hard against the rock, and the rock was the reason it was still there. The compass medallion sat on the table beside the almanac, as it always did. Margaret picked it up without thinking. The old reflex, the gesture she had made 1,000 times since her father had pressed it into her palm. and held it in her hand, the worn, smooth weight of it. The scratched compass rose, pointing northeast toward the cold heart of the mountains. Her father had told her to find Elias Granger if she was ever in real trouble. She had been in real trouble. She had found him. She set the medallion back on the table, and the compass rose pointed northeast, as it always had, and outside the storm said what storms say in the high country, that nothing is guaranteed, that nothing is permanent, that the mountain will outlast everything you think you are. And inside, the fire burned, and the lamp burned, and the two people on the porch remained as they intended to remain for as long as the mountain would have them, which, as it turned out, was a very long time.